What does Robert F. Kennedy Jr. get right and wrong about science, vaccines, and health? Just asking questions. I'm Zach Weissmuller, senior producer for Reason, joined by Reason associate editor Liz Wolfe. Hi, Liz.
Hey, Zach.
So Trump announced RFK Jr. would be his pick for Secretary of Health and Human Services, which oversees the FDA, NIH, CDC, and several other health-related federal agencies. Writing on X that for too long, Americans have been crushed by the industrial food complex and drug companies who have engaged in deception, misinformation, and disinformation when it comes to public health, and that Kennedy will restore these agencies to the traditions of gold standard scientific research and beacons of transparency to end the chronic disease epidemic. So will Kennedy, who has proposed removing fluoride from municipal tap water and rolling back restrictions on everything from psychedelics to raw milk and ivermectin, while banishing food additives and holding vaccine and other pharma manufacturers to stricter standards, make America healthy again? Today's guest will help us work through the good, bad, and unknown of RFK's agenda. Vinay Prasad is a hematologist-oncologist and professor of epidemiology and biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. He's an author of several books about drug and medical policy and writes at the Substack Vinay Prasad's Observations and Thoughts. Vinay Prasad, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me back.
So, I mean, however you feel about him, I think all of us and everyone watching can probably agree that RFK Jr. possibly becoming HHS secretary is a major departure from the norm. What's the significance of RFK possibly becoming the U.S. government's top health official?
Yeah, if it weren't for RFK Jr., we wouldn't be able to do a 1-hour show about his ideas and which are true and false. If it weren't for him. I mean, I think historically the HHS secretary has been someone who comes from the political world, a Tom Price character, or the pharmaceutical world, an Alex Azar character. And typically nobody knows who the HHS secretary is, and they don't do anything that different than the person who came before them. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has a broad set of ideas. So many ideas he's put in the public space over the last 2 or 3 decades. There's a lot to talk about. And in many ways, I view it as people sort of voted for Trump. They said they wanted to turn the snow globe over and shake it up. It looks like he's poised to shake it up.
I'm really interested. You wrote in the Free Press about how we sort of need to establish a little bit of a litmus test for assessing the seriousness of RFK Jr.'s ideas. One of the things that you propose is, well, do other countries do it? Do countries that we ought to look to for advice do it? Could you walk us through that a little bit more and why you think that litmus test is important for people to consider?
Yeah, so I think the media loves to portray RFK Jr. as some quack or conspiracy theorist. I think there's a fairer way to treat him. And the fair way is to say some of his ideas are good and laudable, and we should probably move in that direction. Some of his ideas are debatable, but we could have that debate. We should be open and honest about that debate. And some of his ideas, I think, are so far outside the mainstream and are not really supported by evidence, and I wouldn't want to go there. I wouldn't support those ideas. And the litmus test, I say, for what's debatable and what's right versus what is not is, do other countries do it? And I want to be clear, just because Germany does it or Switzerland does it or Japan does it, doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean that they're doing the right thing. But it does mean that if he suggests something that a bunch of European nations are already doing, that's not a completely crazy idea. That's something that we should be able to talk about. And that's not something that is a existential threat to public health like the media likes to portray.
So I think like water fluoridation is a pretty good example. Are there other ones that come to mind right off the bat?
Yes, water fluoridation, like should municipal water supplies include the additive of fluoride? The other ones that come to mind is he thinks that the FDA should lift a ban on selling raw milk or unpasteurized milk. Other things that come to mind are some of his views on childhood immunization, I think, go too far. But some of his views are supported by a number of European nations that don't have the same childhood immunization schedule as the US. We're more aggressive than a lot of nations. So there's a lot around vaccine safety and childhood immunization that we could talk about. And I'm happy to get into any of these issues.
Well, one thing that just immediately comes to mind here is like part of the reason why RFK Jr.'s star rose, and frankly, same with all of the three of us, was because he was a little bit of this COVID dissenter, right? There were quite a few people who, a lot more people started paying attention to the things that they were saying because they were basically criticizing the mass lockdowns, the mask mandates, the vaccine mandates. If we applied this sort of litmus test that you're proposing of like, what do other countries do? Thinking about like, okay, well, what would have gone differently in the US if we'd done that during COVID? I think in some ways, things could have gone very well if we turned to certain countries that, for example, were sending young children back to school. But in other ways, lots of countries were sort of co-opted by the same COVID madness that we succumbed to. And it could have gotten a lot worse if we'd looked to the example of other countries. How do you examine that? How does that factor in?
Well, I would say that on COVID-19 policy issues, RFK Jr.'s batting average is through the roof. And that's why I think he's gained this newfound following. Let's look at some of the things he said. RFK Jr. was critical of lockdowns. Sweden, of course, famously did not lock down. And now we have excess mortality data for several seasons that shows Sweden is one of the best performers, the least excess mortality. Schools. RFK Jr., I think, was critical of school closure. And let's look at Sweden. They never closed elementary schools. They had tremendously good outcomes. They don't have the learning gaps that we have in the United States. Let's talk about vaccine mandates. RFK Jr. was skeptical of vaccine mandates. I was too. I wrote many op-eds saying we shouldn't go to mandates. Now I think most people agree that mandating a vaccine that they knew could not halt transmission was a fool's errand. I mean, obviously it didn't do any good in terms of benefits to third parties, and it resulted in many people losing employment and has all these sort of spillover effects and mistrust in the system. And now, as many of us predicted, there is a huge loss of trust, I think, in the childhood immunization schedule because of how aggressively they pushed the COVID-19 vaccines. And then about safety. I mean, I think that the leaders at CDC and FDA did not take seriously vaccine safety. When myocarditis became a known safety signal, the Israelis flagged that in February 2021. When vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis from the J&J vaccine was flagged in Europe, the American regulators said nothing. Rochelle Walensky famously said in April, "We haven't seen a signal and we've looked." They sort of gaslit Americans. They lied about that. And they continued to relentlessly push vaccines in the youngest people who are least likely to benefit. So on these issues, I think RFK Jr. did very well. I mean, his natural inherent skepticism, his environmental lawyer background, maybe some of his pre-existing views allowed him to be on the right side of a number of those issues. And that gave him a lot of momentum. And I think that's exactly why he's part of the conversation, as you said.
I struggle a lot with this because on one hand, I totally agree with you. The things that you're citing as areas in which RFK Jr. was really strong in and was frankly comfortable being very bold, being very courageous, as many other people struggled with that. I have to give credit where due. But on the other hand, he very much feels like the type of person who is, a broken clock is wrong or is right twice a day. And at least when I think about some of the arguments that I read coming from you against opposing vaccine mandates, it was sort of you basically saying, hey, like it simply has to be through methods of persuasion, right? We can't have centralized authorities forcing people to do this. Instead, we need to be a little bit more careful with sifting through the data to figure out which vaccines we actually ought to be giving to which age groups. But also we have to be focused on persuasion. Whereas RFK Jr.'s opposition to vaccine mandates appear to be rooted in opposition to the value of vaccines themselves, which is something that I really struggle with, where it's like, is he wrong, or is he correct for sort of the right reasons or the wrong reasons? Do you struggle a little bit with this broken clock situation? Like, does that seem like a good read on RFK Jr., or am I missing something?
It's a very interesting question. And somebody told me RFK Jr., when he gets things right, he gets it right the way a magic 8-ball gets it right. He's just getting random recommendations. But I don't think that's exactly it. So
I don't think that doesn't give him very much credit, and yeah. I'm open to giving him a little bit more credit than that, I think.
Yes. And I would say this is what his philosophy is. And I'll tell you why it worked well in COVID and where it may not work so well. I would describe his philosophy as he approaches medical and biological issues with two, I think, core values. One, autonomy, that people should be able to make decisions for their own body, which is why he's against vaccine mandates, but why he's also pro-choice. That's a position not popular in the Republican Party. So he's both pro-choice and against mandates for medical products. So he's pro-autonomy, high in autonomy. Then the next thing is he has a very strong medical skepticism. He's against corporatism. He's against sort of crony capitalism. And he's extremely skeptical about the substances and chemicals we're exposed to and ingest. And that, I think, stems from his background as an environmental lawyer. The threshold of evidence in environmental law is different than biomedicine. I mean, they're trying to win cases where they're trying to implicate some pollutant that may or may not be responsible for the health problems of a community. And they have a certain, I would say, very permissive or precautionary principle. Like if it might be a problem, we better not put that pollutant in the water. And I think RFK Jr. brings that in. Now, here's why it worked well in COVID. In COVID, we faced a virus where we could debate where it came from, but we have a virus spreading rapidly, as many viruses have spread throughout human history. And unlike historical past, this was one time where the entire globe, because of connected and technology, could take a single concerted response. And human beings are notoriously bad at making big, sweeping, draconian responses to sort of naturally occurring things like a respiratory virus. We closed borders. That did nothing. We closed playgrounds. That did nothing. We panicked. We shut down schools. That was the wrong thing to do. We went after young people. This was a disease with a 10,000-fold age gradient. You know, we made so many blunders. So RFK Jr.'s skepticism that medical interventions can do more harm than good, it served him well in COVID because lots of what we did was wrong. A few things we did were right. Develop a vaccine in a short time span, go after some older people in nursing homes. A few things we did were right, but so much of what we did was fear-based. So the type of error he made wasn't very prone there. Now let me contrast him with, let's talk about, an Alex Azar. Let's talk about, an FDA commissioner like Gottlieb. They make, I think, a different type of error. These are more traditional Republican figures. They have a long track record of rotating in and out of pharmaceutical firms or consulting for pharmaceutical firms. They like the system as it is because it creates massive profits for the people who make these medical products. And the error they make is they're much more likely to approve a vaccine that don't work. They're much more likely to approve a product that actually doesn't make you better because people get rich off that. RFK Jr. will make the opposite error, I think. He's much more likely to stigmatize a product that might actually help you than he is to approve a product that don't going to help you, that's not going to work at all. So I think it's just a different type of philosophy and a different type of error. I don't think he's a magic 8-ball. I think it's good to be clear on what the mistake he makes is, but I also think we have to recognize the current system makes a big mistake. And the mistake is they do things to generate massive profits from massive corporate entities. And he is making the opposite mistake because he's not in that camp.
Yeah, I really appreciate you laying out that sort of, grand view of what the philosophy that motivates RFK is, what's sort of the systemic issues with our existing system. Sounds like RFK in your telling is something of a course correction, and we have to be careful not to overcorrect into this hyper precautionary zone where nothing is going to be allowed. And, so like, for us, it's like we want to be careful and like maintain our skepticism of RFK, but not fall into RFK derangement syndrome, which I think is also a danger. So like in that spirit, I would like us to go through some of the specific proposals that RFK has laid out, and maybe you can apply that lens that you've just described to some of them. The first one I wanted to talk about was fluoride, because that's something that has come up multiple times on in RFK's public statements. He writes here that on January 20th, the Trump White House will advise all U.S. water systems to remove fluoride from public water. Fluoride is an industrial waste associated with arthritis, bone fractures, bone cancer, IQ loss, neurodevelopmental disorders, and thyroid disease. President real Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump want to make America healthy again. And he links to a recent lawsuit that we also pulled up here. This was a lawsuit filed against the EPA. And what the plaintiffs in the lawsuit were saying is that the EPA needs to look at the fluoride issue and they need to issue a regulation of some kind. It's kind of open-ended what that regulation could be. But what the court found is that the fluoridation of water at 0.7 milligrams per liter, which is the level presently considered optimal in the United States, poses an unreasonable risk of reduced IQ in children. It should be noted that this finding does not conclude with certainty that fluoridated water is injurious to public health. Rather, as required by the Toxic Substances Control Act, I think that's what that stands for, the court finds there is an unreasonable risk of such injury, a risk sufficient to require the EPA to engage with a regulatory response. So in other words, the judge is saying, yes, the EPA does. I'm not saying that fluoride is dangerous and making the kids dumber, but it's possible, and the EPA needs to do something about this. What's your reaction to all of the fluoride discourse?
Well, I drank too much fluoride as a child, so I'm not able to process.
Same
No,
here.
okay. So, I mean, one point, when RFK Jr. says it does all those things, yeah, if you have an overdose of fluoride, it will do bad things to you. Also, if you drink too much water, it'll do bad things to you too. You can get hyponatremia if you drink too much water. Okay, so that's one point to make there. The next point to make is, I think you really highlighted it nicely. That is the way an environmental law proceeding would judge fluoride. They're not saying for sure it's a risk at that level. They're just saying it possibly has a risk for that. Okay, my view on the issue. I've looked at a lot of the IQ studies and fluoride. I'm not persuaded that fluoride at the doses we are exposed to it actually does reduce IQ in children. I could be persuaded by that in future studies. The studies that are done to date, I think, have a lot of problems with the studies. I'm happy to get into that, but I just set aside there's a lot of problems with that, making that strong claim. The next point to make, I think, is let's talk about the other side of the ledger. The other side of the ledger is, what does fluoride do for cavities? And fluoride has some reduction in cavities and caries in children who are exposed to fluoride when their pregnant mothers drink fluorinated water. I think there are a number of studies that show that benefit of fluoride when we started putting fluoride in the waters in the 1920s and 30s and 40s was really big. But as time has gone on and we have better dental hygiene, better fluoride in our toothpaste, as we're doing a better job of brushing our teeth, the rate of cavities in countries that add fluoride to the water and countries that don't has fallen markedly in both sets of countries. So putting it all together, I guess I'd say that there's a reason why Europe is divided on this issue. And even America is. Portland doesn't put fluoride in the water, for instance. And the reason is, is the benefit on cavities so valuable that we should expose everybody to this, many of whom are not going to drive much benefit or drive a small benefit, if anything at all. And I think different countries come to different conclusions. Germany does not put fluoride in the water. Personally, for me, it's not a hill to die on either way. I actually think I'm annoyed when I hear people say he's such a kook, he wants to take fluoride out of the water. Well, a lot of countries don't have fluoride in the water, and Portland doesn't have fluoride in the water. And I also am annoyed when people that fluoride does all these horrible things. Well, probably not at the doses you're exposed to. It's probably something in between. And let's see what happens. If he actually puts that advisory, we all know what's going to happen. The Trump administration says, don't put fluoride in your water. Well, every red state, red district, they're going to take that fluoride right out of the water. And
that's already happening in Florida, by the way, where I am. One town has taken it out, and the Surgeon General of the state has already said we're taking it out. But I assume you're going to say California is going to double the dosage.
Correct. We'll add a little bit more. We'll add a little more in California just to show them. And parents who are in Florida who want to have their kid have a little more fluoride will probably find a way to supplement with different types of ways.
I'm not that worried about it.
Yeah, I'm not that worried about it. So that's my overall view of it. Yeah. But I mean, fluoride, it's an interesting issue because I think it speaks to, some people just don't want people putting anything in their tap water. That's the kind of gut feeling some people have.
I mean, I think that's somewhat defensible, right? This idea of don't dose me against my will, especially if you're the government. Don't make the decision for me or for my kids. But one thing I'm actually really curious about, because I went, I'm the mother of a young child. I live in New York City, so they're probably dosing him with so much fluoride these days. But I went deep down a rabbit hole, and a few of my other friends with young kids did this a few weeks ago. And it's kind of an area where I didn't really know very much about it. And then I very quickly stumbled upon the fact that actually a whole bunch of countries handle this very differently than one another. And so what RFK is proposing is not, it's not some sort of weird fringe quack thing. This is something that, in Germany, they have big debates over this type of thing. So are there other things that RFK advocates that fall into that same category where when you initially hear about the controversy, you're like, oh, there's that weird quack guy doing some fringe stuff. But in reality, it's no, this is actually sort of an area that's very unsettled where a whole bunch of different countries have different approaches. And it's a legitimate, your mileage may vary type thing. Are there other things that RFK Jr. has raised awareness of that fall into that same category in your estimation?
In my estimation, probably most of what he says is that category. For instance, he's against certain pesticides that are banned in Europe. He's against certain dyes and food chemicals that are banned in Europe. He's for the sale of raw milk. What that means is, in the United States, you are not allowed to sell, aside from very small, niche uses, unpasteurized milk to someone else. And the risk is, and the reason being that unpasteurized milk has the risk of infectious disease outbreaks. But what is that actual risk? The economist Emily Oster has calculated it as 7 in 100,000 based on her calculation, the number of people who drink raw milk and the number of sort of foodborne illnesses from raw milk. That risk is, it's not zero, but it's not, 1,000 in 100,000. It's a risk that we let healthy people take. And there are a number of countries in Europe that allow the sale of unpasteurized milk. Now, I'm not going to drink unpasteurized milk. I'm not going to drink milk. I don't really like milk. But I do think that a healthy adult should be able to drink unpasteurized milk if they want. And government shouldn't prohibit that when they're allowed to do other things that are just as unhealthy or more unhealthy. So to me, that's not a great, that's a good, point for RFK Jr. on body autonomy. And I would say that the majority of things that the media initially goes crazy about, just like with COVID-19, are things that are being done across Europe. They reopened their schools. They didn't mandate kids get vaccines. They don't have an annual booster for children. These are well-established policies in Europe, and that's what he's suggesting here.
One really quick question before we move on. Atrazine in the water supply, and like what do you make of that?
I'll have to read more. I don't know how much atrazine.
Or what about like anything related to like declining testosterone levels over time? Like I know RFK Jr. has some theories surrounding that. Like, is he onto something or is he just like off his rocker here?
I guess I haven't looked into it, but I have one thing I want to say about testosterone levels, which is that I think we have a little bit of an epidemic of over-diagnosing people with low testosterone. One of the reasons why older men have low testosterone is it's supposed to be low. Okay, you're not supposed to be supplementing testosterone.
The only person with high T at their age, at an advanced age, is RFK Jr. Actually, he's the only one bucking the trend.
Because he probably does testosterone replacement therapy, right?
You might. And I would also suggest that there's a number of meta-analyses of testosterone, quote unquote, replacement therapy or extra testosterone in older men. And the ones that are funded by the testosterone industry says it doesn't raise heart attacks, but the ones not funded by the testosterone industry says it does. And so, I mean, I think that we need to learn a lot more about who should be getting testosterone and when. As a cancer doctor, we definitely do have patients who need it. But it's also, I think, widely overused.
I mean, that sort of raises one of the central, what I see as a sort of the paradox of RFK is that he's so skeptical of mainstream medicine, and probably for good reason in a lot of cases. But then in that tweet we showed at the beginning, he's like jumps right into so many alternative remedies that I think have maybe even shakier evidence, whether it's, ivermectin or TRT, like these things that are still on the cutting edge. He's like, yes, that needs to be applied across the board. Is his that sort of, I don't know, like ad hoc approach to things, the way he talks about things, is that going to be a problem in terms of really public health communication? If he is like maybe sort of right about fluoridating water, but he's saying it in this really catastrophizing way, is that going to undermine our ability to like make sense of anything?
Okay, you make a really good point. I'll come back to fluoridated water, but about the things he does promote: chelation, stem cell therapy, and during the pandemic, I think maybe not him particularly, but people in his orbit, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and vitamin D and zinc and these sorts of things. So what is this philosophy? Why do the same people who are incredibly skeptical of remdesivir and Paxlovid and COVID vaccines also embrace these sorts of other pills and products, repurposed products? To me, I think the philosophy is they're not very skeptical when it comes to medicines that they think there's sort of a conspiracy to suppress, or medicines that don't make a lot of money. So vitamin D, it's cheap to buy. Ivermectin is cheap to buy. They suspect that it might work, and that there's somebody who wants you to steer you towards the costly branded pharmaceuticals and not these other products. Now here, I think he would be served better by a little more skepticism, because I think things like chelation have failed in multiple randomized studies. Things like stem cell therapy, while it is promising in very niche indications, probably a lot of it's just not going to work or harm people. Things like vitamin D and hydroxychloroquine and zinc, you didn't need. Most people who had COVID, they just needed some time to rest in their bed. They didn't need this cocktail of pills, and it didn't do anything. We have many randomized studies of all those drugs, and people quibble with the doses and when they were given, but show me a study where it actually helped. So I think that's a blind spot. Now, you raise an interesting question. What will that do for public health? If he really starts to approve something like some of these products, like let's just take a hypothetical. Right now, I hear people tell me that ivermectin has some role in cancer therapy. I'm a cancer doctor, and I can tell you, I don't think it does. You can give ivermectin all you want. The tumor's not going to shrink, so I don't think it's doing anything for the cancer. But some people believe it. Now, somebody tells me, well, God forbid, RFK Jr. might make the FDA approve ivermectin for cancer. How bad would that be? I'd say, well, I wouldn't like that. That would be not a great decision, but I don't know if it would be so bad. Here's why. One, a person who wants to can already prescribe ivermectin off-label. You can prescribe all sorts of drugs off-label, so somebody who wants to do it can already do it. Two, most people are not going to do it. Most doctors, oncologists are going to say, no, I'm not giving my patient ivermectin. There's going to be a handful of people who really want to do it who get access to trying it. And in some respects, that's similar to a lot of branded investigational medicines we do allow on the market. We do approve drugs with 90 people get access. 90 people are studied in an uncontrolled study, and then we approve a cancer drug, a new cancer drug. It just costs $200,000. We do have a right to try provision that was passed under the first Trump administration that allows patients to have access to investigational products and pharmaceutical firms that are not yet FDA approved. So in some ways, America has always allowed people who are dying to try things, even if doctors don't think they make a lot of sense. So in my mind, I'm not sure that even if he acted like a reckless approver, it's going to change the practice too much. That's my gut feeling on that. And then last thing I think, one more point.
Go ahead.
One more point is that I think we should appreciate that this is a unique situation where RFK Jr. is on one side and everyone's on the other side. The media's against him. Every talking head's against him. All these people on Twitter are against him. He's not going to get away with doing lots of reckless things without massive pushback. That's different than I think the prior administration. When you get somebody like Ashish Jha come in and he says every 6-month-old needs a booster COVID-19 vaccine. Where's the New York Times article interviewing anyone skeptical of that policy? When Anthony Fauci said 2-year-olds need to wear masks, where was anybody pushing back on those policies? When you have an outsider figure setting policies that don't make sense, the media has a check and balance. When you have an establishment figure setting policies that don't make sense, there's no check and balance. And that to me is much more dangerous.
It sounds like you're saying something which is frankly kind of new to me, because I feel like so many people are very sensational about this topic, where RFK Jr. is neither chaotic good nor chaotic evil. He is in fact chaotic neutral. And like there's a fair amount that he throws his weight behind that's legitimate and actually, legitimately worth asking questions about. But some of the solutions that he offers are not necessarily going to be these huge silver bullets. And it's important to actually sift through the evidence that he's presenting and maintain sort of like a cool head about it, right? Which is something that apparently is in short supply these days. One of the things that I think is really interesting, though, and I'm curious about your perspective here, is, a big plank of the Make America Healthy Again initiative really has to do with nutrition. And RFK Jr. has said some really interesting things about food additives. John, could you play the clip that we have queued up? I want to get your reaction.
Doritos, Cheez-Its, Captain Crunch, gummy bears. Everyone knows that these are junk foods, so maybe you wouldn't be too surprised to see that the ingredients include a lot of poisons, including a harmful yellow dye called tatrazine, or yellow dye number 5. What you may not know is that this dye was originally made out of the sludge that's left over when you turn coal into coke for blast furnaces. A century ago, it was just an obnoxious industrial byproduct that everybody was trying to figure out ways to get rid of. But then a British chemist figured out that the coal tar could be used to derive fabric dye. And if fabric dye, why not food? They didn't know back then that this yellow dye, tartrazine, causes tumors, asthma, developmental delays, neurological damage, ADD, ADHD, hormone disruption, gene damage, anxiety, depression, intestinal injuries. Well, we know it now. We've known this for decades. That's why tartrazine is heavily restricted in other countries. Today, it's made from petroleum, not coal tar. Either way, it's crazy to add this to your kids' favorite foods. It doesn't even change the flavor. I've been picking on tartrazine today, but that's just one of at least 100 chemical poisons that our health agencies allow into our children's food. I can make a video just like this to talk about Red 40, BHA, BHD, potassium bromate, chemical after chemical, and on and on and on. If just one of them can cause all of these problems, imagine what they're doing in combination. That has never been studied. If we took all of these chemicals out, our nation would get healthier immediately. We'd have fewer sick days. We'd have better focus. We'd have less anxiety. Our kids would learn more easily. We'd lose weight. We'd have more energy. We'd have fewer tumors and longer lives.
I want to cut it here. I want to make sure I don't fall into the sort of like luxury beliefs hypocrisy here. Like, I don't let my kid eat any of those things, but that's primarily because they're empty, stupid carbs and lots of sugar. And he likes meat sticks and cheese sticks and fresh fruit. And so I just gravitate toward that. But is RFK saying anything that's legitimate here? Is any of this persuasive to you?
Well, I was going to make the same point you made, which is that we can take all the dye out of Fruit Loops, but it's still a bowl of shit. You know, it's still like unhealthy food, sugar sweetened, refined carbohydrate. You can take all the dyes out. In fact, you might be better off just eating the bowl of dyes and not eating the Fruit Loops themselves. I mean, well, and one, he sounded a little bit like a drug addict. This could cause lethargy and somnolence and impotence and, you know, on and on and on. What are my thoughts on his? I mean, I suspect, I have not looked into this dye, but I suspect he's spot on in terms of where the dye comes from. I don't doubt that. I think he's probably correct. It is a derivative of petroleum. Many of these dyes are derivatives of sort of derivatives of different sort of chemical processes. I also think that he speaks to a strong intuition, which is that we do add a lot of ridiculous processed dyes and other ingredients, preservatives to our food. And maybe there is more uncertainty about the health impact of that. The part that he loses me a little bit is that I guess I'm skeptical that even if you took out all the dyes, we would immediately correct the bigger problems in America. The problem is we eat too many calories, too many refined calories, cheap and easy calories. I think it's a lot harder problem to fix than just removing a dye here or there. Now, I also think that if you remove the dyes, would I support him? Sure. I mean, I think a lot of European nations do remove a lot of these dyes because they're acting according to the precautionary principle. I also think he's sort of betraying the fact that he is an environmental lawyer. Listen to how he talks about this issue. So I would be happy to see those dyes removed. I guess my question is that my concern is it's not nearly enough to make people fit. You're going to have to change diet in a very broad way. Now, one of the things that wasn't shown in that video that I've heard him say that I thought was really tremendous is that if you go to the school lunches that are being served kids, often for free in any school district in America, it is terrible school lunches. I mean, it's food that no healthy adult would ever eat for themselves. They're cheap, ultra-processed garbage. If he were to take some funds and make school lunches for kids better, I think he would do a lot for the health of Americans, and he would do something that has bipartisan support and people would really get behind.
The thing I always struggle with a little bit with the school lunches, because, you know, we're libertarians. I've written critically about different school lunch programs in the past, but they are like honestly faced with the challenge of how to get kids to actually eat the lunches that are being provided. And I think you're totally right that like there would just have to be absolutely fast, like broad cultural change in order to actually get people living a certain way. There's something very like heartbreaking about the fact that like, you know, richer, more educated families have kids. Like, I don't know, like I give my kid all kind of douchey Whole Foods crap, you know, with the nice like matte wrapping versus the shiny wrapping, like, you know, like that type of thing. And now there's becoming a little bit of this like two-pronged marketing strategy of like, you know, some stuff that's not necessarily that great for kids, you know, it's Whole Foodsified versus mass produced and mass marketed in this other way. And I think there's a little bit of this problem where lots of people, you know, it's relatively easy to market things as healthier alternatives when they in fact are not necessarily. But I want to bring us to like one other area that RFK Jr. has really latched onto, which is seed oils. And I'm curious about what you make of this. The New York Times ran kind of a stupid fact check on this, where, you know, they basically were extremely dismissive of this. I think in part because this has become a fairly right-coded thing. This is something that, you know, you hear frequently discussed on Joe Rogan's program. And I, at least, like I cook pretty much all of my food in tallow or butter. And I've very much done away with canola oil, as well as just like the practice of deep frying in general. What do you make of all of this? And is RFK in fact like a wonderful seed oil whistleblower? Like, is this something that would make a big impact on people's diets?
Well, the New York Times has gotten a few of fact checks incorrect. I think that's one that's problematic. And the other one where they said that they compared the cereals across countries and they had to change it and say RFK Jr. objects to the total number of ingredients. No, he objects to artificial ingredients, not the total number of ingredients. Okay. So what do I think about this? I would say the way I approach the question is different. Once upon a time, we did a tremendous amount of cooking in things like tallow and ghee and sort of saturated fats. French fries were routinely fried in tallow. We moved from tallow, which makes a very crisp and delicious French fry, to a bunch of seed oil, canola oil, vegetable oil, sunflower oil. We did that because people said that was healthier for you. I think now it's abundantly clear that seed oils are not, in fact, healthier for you than those other saturated fats. I disagree with the contention. They're just talking about the constituent components of the oil. They're not talking about the implications of eating the oil on longevity, where I think there's no strong evidence that vegetable oils and seed oils as substitutes for those fats described actually make you live longer, live better. So
and that's exactly the argument that the New York Times is making in this fact check. It's like, it feels like at least a decade out of date or something. Like, we know that all these things are all these seed oils are linked with lower cardiovascular risk, diabetes risk, and you're
look
saying,
how they write
like,
it.
we definitely do not know
nutrition
that.
experts say, Zach, nutrition. How could you are you a nutrition expert? Come on, Zach.
I don't
look
think
look how they write
honestly.
it. They say decades of research have shown that seed oils are not only safe, but heart-healthy unsaturated fats have been linked with reduced risks of cardiovascular disease. See, it's a daisy chain of linkage. I mean, people who do eat unsaturated fats like olive oil, they do better, but substituting seed oil for lard has never been directly shown to improve health outcomes. I think it's a daisy chain of inferences. And I think, to your point, Zach, it is about 10 years out of date with what I think most people would say this year. Nutrition experts, I think it's easy to be an expert of something with very poor evidence, because I'm an expert. I'll be an expert next week. So here's the way I think RFK may go too far when he says things like that, seed oils are a poison or a carcinogen, these kinds of things. I'm not convinced of those most extreme claims. But if he wants to say something like, we moved from these fats that we've been using for hundreds and perhaps thousands of years to seed oil for no good reason, the quality and flavor of our food has declined, and we don't have a commensurate increase in health, why did we do it? I think that's a very strong argument to me. Why did we switch to seed oils? And maybe we should no longer subsidize seed oils. That's the other thing we're not talking about. So much food policy is not banning something. It's simply eliminating a subsidy that allows cheap, unhealthy products to thrive when they would not thrive in a free marketplace.
Yeah, I have so as part of RFK's nutrition paradigm, he has said he wants to eliminate those subsidies, or perhaps rebalance the subsidies and subsidize things that he thinks are good, which I don't think is a great idea either. But part of his fire has been targeted at Ozempic, because the use of Ozempic has just proliferated, and it seems to be getting some pretty dramatic results in a lot of cases. We have a clip of RFK talking about Ozempic, and I'd love to get your reaction to the RFK take on this, because it's a huge issue now that in health and science. So let's play that.
The idea that a drug is going to cure drug addiction or alcoholism. We're spending $1,600 a month on this drug. There's a bill right now before Congress that will make it available to everybody who's overweight, which is 74% of the American population. That alone will cost $3 trillion a year. If we spent about 1/5 of that giving good food, 3 meals a day, to every man, woman, and child in our country, we could solve the obesity and diabetes epidemic overnight. A tiny fraction of the cost. Oh, they're trying to sell this. There's a huge push to sell this to the American public, and it's now the biggest company in Europe, but they're not marketing it in Europe. They make this drug in Denmark, and in Denmark, they do not recommend it for diabetes or for obesity. They recommend dietary and behavioral changes. In our country, they're counting on selling it to Americans because we're so stupid and so addicted to drugs.
So there's a couple of things that strike me there. One is that he, of course, is right that taking Ozempic is not getting to the root problem that has caused whatever metabolic disorder someone's dealing with. On the other hand, just whatever these grand plans are to have everyone provided with 3 healthy meals a day and somehow ensure that is what they are eating seems a little hubristic. And there's a lot of people who are like, they're so far gone health-wise that maybe there is a reason for some intervention, like something that can just like get them back on the right track. And I guess my worry for someone like RFK suddenly being in a position of power is he going to then start leaning on the FDA or what using whatever levers of power he can to make Ozempic less available to people who it actually could help? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great topic. I mean, health policy, you need to have a scalpel and not a sword. So let's apply the scalpel to Ozempic, not the sword. So Ozempic, I think, clearly improves cardiovascular events and has favorable effects on everything if you're older, type 2 diabetic, and overweight. I mean, I think there's clearly populations that derive great benefit from Ozempic, and it needs to be used. I mean, I think it's a drug that, in fact, may save you money because they're not having more downstream health complications. At the same time, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended last year, I believe, that even 12-year-olds who are overweight should be candidates for Ozempic. I think the truth is probably something in between. Do we really want to put a 12-year-old on Ozempic and then they have to take it for what, 50, 60, 70 years? Because the moment you stop taking Ozempic, a number of studies show a large weight rebound. I mean, that's the other thing that's under discussed is Ozempic works as long as you keep taking it. And what percent of people in the real world actually discontinue? We're going to publish that paper soon. We have it done. It's higher than people think. So my point about Ozempic is that I do worry that it'll be overused. And I do worry, to his core points, that there's a huge profit incentive to medicalize society. I also worry, as you do, that if you go in there with the sword, you could actually end up harming a population that actually does benefit from Ozempic and needs Ozempic. In terms of the solution of giving people food, I'm also skeptical, as you are, that would be a durable solution or that people would even do it. But there's a core kernel, I think, of truth to what he's saying, which is our healthcare system is really, really good at funding things that generate profit for shareholders. You got a new drug, you got a new treatment for cancer that you can take tons of people's money and shovel it into a new company. That's going to get covered by Medicare, Medicaid. It's going to get, expedited. If I have a cancer patient in my clinic and all I want is someone to go to this person's house twice a week to help him do dishes and help him just tidy up a little bit, that's impossible to get in the current insurance system. I mean, I can't get my cancer patients rides to my appointments, but I can give them a useless $200,000 a month medication. That's my frustration as a cancer doc. We prioritize things that consolidate wealth and not health interventions that disperse wealth to lots of caregivers or things like that. That's, I think, a bias of the American system. And I think that's kind of what he's speaking to there. Now, I don't think that he'll be able to operationalize a meal delivered to every overweight person. And then the last point I make, it is interesting to me that he has the guts to go up against the pharmaceutical industry, because I think that, people always say, why can't we get somebody who has all RFK's good views without those problematic views? And I say, you're not going to get that person. It's either going to be this person who has a range of complicated views, or the next person is going to be somebody we don't have a 1-hour discussion about. It's going to be some pharmaceutical company insider who just wants to generate more profits. They're going to get more Ozempic, prescribed. They're not really going to care. And 5 years from now, we won't even remember their names because they made no mark on history. This is somebody who's coming in with a lot of ideas. I think some have potential to be really good. Some have potential to have, externalities and downstream things that he's not thinking about. But people ask for it. You want to change and you got it. He's going to change a lot of things, I think.
I mean, on that last point, I want to bring in an audience question that I saw before Liz takes us to vaccines, which is really where things get controversial with RFK. This is from the Biblical Anarchy podcast, who is someone we've interacted with often on Twitter. He's a fan. He's a good guy. Maybe RFK Jr., as imperfect as he is a necessary but unfortunate overcorrection to the current medical establishment regime. I feel like it'll be a mixed bag, but in the right direction. Thoughts?
I guess I'm also curious about what would happen. I mean, there is definitely, we're going to talk about vaccines, but he can definitely do some things that do a great deal of damage. I mean, let's be clear about that. You can do things and really make things worse. But also, let's be honest about American medicine. We spend 20% of GDP on healthcare. Our life expectancy had declined in the prior 5 years, even pre-COVID, from the opioid epidemic. We sanctioned the opioid epidemic. We made that possible. We didn't even have to have it. Our life expectancy is far inferior to peer nations. our healthcare system is so profoundly broken, and it does affect everyday people every single day because your paycheck has been stagnating for 20 years because it's all going into healthcare premiums. And we've created a whole administrative bureaucratic class running all these corporations, absolutely providing no net value to society. And Americans are fed up with that. And that's to some degree why they voted for Donald Trump. And they know they were going to get an RFK because he was standing next to him every damn day on the stump. So people signed up for RFK Jr., whether people like it or not. And he's going to come in there. And honestly, he's going to be subverted at every stage. I suspect that right now they're lobbying senators, the pharmaceutical industry. They're going to lose $100 billion plus if this guy comes to power. They're lobbying senators to vote against him. They're going to put every roadblock in. They're going to try to get the establishment to slow his anything he tries to do that erodes profits. He maybe get a few things of all his ideas, only a few things done. Because turning a country is not like turning a sailboat. It's like turning a battleship. It's a very tough thing to turn around. He'll do a few things. My intuition is he's not going to do the worst things people feel. He's not going to do those horrible things for early childhood immunization because there'll be so much pushback against those things. I think he will focus on the things where he has more consensus because he knows otherwise he's going to be, dead in the water. He won't be able to do anything. So I suspect it is perhaps the most interesting time in my entire 20-year career in medicine ever is right now and what will happen in the next 2 years. And it's a conversation we've never had before.
One thing I keep going back to, because I'm sympathetic to what you're saying, especially the argument that this is democracy, right? Like the left loves to talk about what is or is not democracy and how it dies in darkness. But the American people have very much voted for a huge shift in how we look at a lot of these things. And I think I'm pretty prone to enjoy experimentation. So I'm kind of excited to see okay, well, we need a disruptor. Will this type of disruption be good? But one thing that comes to mind with RFK Jr. specifically is that his earlier views on vaccines, not the COVID vaccine, but childhood immunizations like the measles vaccine, I think are somewhat telling in that they give us an indication as to how credible he is at actually sifting through the evidence and making recommendations. And so there's something that's very telling about his intellect and whether or not he sufficiently course corrects. One thing I'm specifically worried about is he is a huge skeptic, publicly casting doubt on the efficacy of the measles vaccine, especially comparing the efficacy to the possible harms. And then we have seen, especially in the last few years, somewhat cyclically, measles outbreaks in places where there's less vaccine uptake. I know we had a significant one, I believe, in Washington State. There's also been little pockets, I think, in California as well. Are you worried about this dynamic where as RFK continues to publicly cast doubt on things that we know to be pretty useful, like the measles vaccine, parents, in fact, listen to him, these ideas become more mainstream, and then we have these clusters, or maybe not even clusters at all, these vast swaths of the country where children are suffering from something that we really have the technology to prevent?
Yes. So let me be clear. I think the MMR vaccine is definitely not linked to autism. I think there are really good studies that exclude even very tiny risk increases like odds ratios 1.01, like really good studies showing it's not linked to autism. And I also think it's very important that people get the MMR vaccine because if you don't give it to a certain fraction of the population, you will get measles outbreaks and those will be devastating. And people may remember the bitterness of diseases that we've long since forgotten about. So I think those are two bad things. Now,
before you go on, Vinay, let me just bring up one of the landmark studies on that question was out of Denmark because it was a huge study. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that one, but it had
my favorite
650,000 children born in Denmark from 1999 through December 2010, and there was follow-ups from 1 year of age to 2013. So be like 14 years of age. And what they found is comparing MMR vaccinated with MMR unvaccinated children yielded a fully adjusted autism hazard ratio of 0.93. So anything under 1 would be like a negative. Like if anything, it's like slightly less likely to get autism if you had the vaccine. And this is it visualized for our viewers. You can see there's like a solid line down the middle, and anything to the left of that line, they break it down by age, by type of vaccine, by did your sibling have autism, and anything to the left of that line shows a slightly negative correlation. There's one there that says siblings with autism actually did have a elevated risk of autism after the vaccine. I don't know what explains that, or if there's that's kind of a statistical anomaly or not. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's noise, but yeah, go on.
It's noise. Okay. So that's just one example of a fairly large study casting pretty significant doubt on the vaccine autism link, which, as we showed earlier with these RFK quotes, RFK has done a lot to sow distrust about. But continue making your point, Vinay.
So, I mean, I know that study by Anders, and I would say also, I'm no fan of Anders' broader work. I think on COVID-19, he got a lot of things wrong, but that's a decent study. And the most important takeaway to me is the upper bound of the confidence interval is 1.02, meaning it excludes any sort of real increased risk completely. That study does. Okay, but let me go to the point. So we all start this conversation but we agree, the MMR vaccine good, vaccine below a certain threshold bad, you'll get measles outbreaks. Okay. The point I want to make is that this die has been cast. I mean, I think if you really want to pin what's the greatest driver of 21st century vaccine hesitancy, what is it and what will it be in the next 10 years? That die has been cast. It was cast by many decisions during the Biden era. One, that vaccine mandate, making people who had already had the disease get vaccinated and firing them if you didn't. That was the greatest anti-vax policy you could have ever set. The second thing, the CDC added that COVID-19 vaccine to the routine childhood immunization schedule. The dumbest decision I've ever seen. Other countries do not do this. And the reason that's bad is a number of pediatrics practices say you either are all in or you're all out, or we're going to throw you out. You're forcing people to make this choice, all or nothing. It's absolutely crazy. Kids don't need the COVID-19 vaccine. They do need MMR. And policymakers should have had the decency to distinguish between those two things. And by lumping them together, the CDC is also the greatest force for anti-vaccine ideas that will ever happen in the 21st century. Now, what about RFK? We act as if RFK is steering the ship. I don't think he is. He's just another inevitable, domino in the domino chain. There's always been this move. Autism is, I think, on the rise. There's never been a satisfactory explanation. It would be natural for people to try to explain it by the things they did to the kid that leave a memory. And a kid getting a shot leaves a memory, and then you notice the kid was not acting the way the kid acted before. So I think it's human nature that some people would wrongly make that link in their mind. And there's always going to be some people stoking that. And there's always going to be the establishment trying to provide a clear and evidence-based answer to that question. And in that, RFK emerges. And so my point is, whether he's in power or not in power, I think it's not going to change the anti-vaccine trajectory, which is going to get worse before it gets better. I worry it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, because the outbreaks we're seeing now is from not vaccinating a long time ago. Now that people are not vaccinating, we're going to see more outbreaks, a couple of years from now. It'll be even worse. I'm very worried about that.
I have a possibly stupid question. But while you're here, why not I just broadcast my stupidity to the entire internet? Is some of this making the case for giving parents more leeway to do more childhood vaccination delays? Specifically because if they're basically looking at this memorable situation of the time their child got a shot and noticing signs of autism that occurred after that, could there in fact be some value to the child getting said vaccination later in their overall development, as is reasonable, depending on the vaccine? And that way the parent can, if those signs of autism have actually been developing, they might have noticed them prior to the actual immunization, and thus the vaccine won't be seen as this culprit, right? Like, instead of attempting to convince parents out of it, allowing them more leeway as to when they schedule the immunization in order to possibly make clear to them that there isn't exactly this causal effect the way that they might think. Like, is there any downside to doing something like that within reason with some of these vaccines? Or is MMR just one where it wouldn't really work?
I love what you're saying. And I think you're actually really hitting the nail on the head. How do you really combat vaccine hesitancy? You give people what they feel has been taken away, autonomy. Now, if you take
Yeah.
the US vaccination schedule, you take the schedule in Sweden and Germany and Switzerland, and you've nicely shown it, it's not the same country by country. There are differences. Other countries, for instance, don't universally give hepatitis B vaccine at birth. They delay it. In this country, we routinely test mothers for Hep B. That's a low-risk product. You can see that shown right there on the figure. The dark green says it is a recommendation for specific groups only at birth, and it is different than the US. I guess I would say, if as a scientist, if I were advising RFK Jr., I would say there's a simple study we can do in the US that will answer many of these questions. We can do a cluster randomized study where we go US schedule in some areas, other areas get randomized to a different schedule, like something from, say, Switzerland or Sweden, and other areas give patients the choice among a couple schedules. I bet the moment you give a little bit of choice, you may even increase vaccination uptake because people say, I like what they're doing in the UK, I'm going to take that. And we have to be very careful. Some of these vaccines are really, really well established and everyone agrees are good. Some, I think, are debatable. And I hate when I hear doctors say vaccines are safe and effective. Vaccines save lives. Well, drugs are safe and effective, the right drug for the right person at the right time. But no one says all drugs are always safe and effective. And the COVID-19 vaccine in young men was net harmful. Okay, so you can make mistakes too. And then the last thing I'd say, the two biggest safety signals with COVID-19 vaccines were heart inflammation and that clotting disorder. And neither of those safety signals were first discovered in the United States. The heart issue came from Israel. The clotting disorder came from the European nations. Why is our safety system so crappy that when our CDC director was asked at the end of April, have you seen myocarditis? He says, we've looked at 100 million doses and we have not seen a signal. Our safety detection system is broken. He should come in and fix that. Make a system that scientists will agree. If it finds a signal, it's a real signal. With COVID-19 vaccines, I think many scientists are worried there may be other signals that are not well attributed. For instance, tinnitus or ringing in the ears. I think there's some papers that say it's linked. Some papers say it's not linked. Why can't we have a system where we definitively answer these questions? That's how I would take RFK's idea and turn it into sort of a more science idea. But to your point, you're not going to win. I think this anti-vaccine or vaccine hesitancy, I will call it. I think we are not going to win people over by demonizing RFK, by calling him a quack, by delegitimizing them, by making stronger sticks and making stronger rules. You're only going to win people over by showing you actually do care about vaccine safety, by actually doing some studies, and by actually giving people more autonomy, the thing they feel that's been taken away. And I think also by studying autism, the thing they feel is understudied.
I think on a
The
very
stick that-
fundamental level, it's very obvious that parents don't want to harm their children, right? And there's something very frustrating about the hectoring from the government and the mainstream media, acting as if parents don't have their child's best interests at heart and in mind. And I wonder how much our discourse would be fixed if everyone kind of started from that proposition and then we move forward from there. And I think that something that's very appealing about what RFK Jr. is selling is that he's attempting to basically supply answers that parents have been searching for. I think you're totally right that like the more we can actually provide satisfactory answers to these parents who are searching, the more sense it'll all make. But acting as if they don't love their children or don't want to make the best decisions for their children, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. Go ahead, Zach. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, the stick that is usually used to get children vaccinated is requiring it up to enter a public school, right? And that, you have to get your immunizations to be allowed in. And that seems like something that RFK is interested in shaking up. Where do you draw the line there? Because we all, as Liz and I, as libertarians, want autonomy for parents and children, but I recognize that when it comes to an infectious disease, that there are externalities if you're not vaccinated. So where do you draw the line in terms of coercion?
Okay, so it's a very good question. And I guess I'm not a pure libertarian, meaning that I do think sometimes coercion can be applied, or perhaps libertarians do as well, if the net benefit to third parties is so great it overweighs the individual right to autonomy. I think some purists would say even then no. But I'll come to this. I would approach this question. I'll talk. That's a great time. I would approach this question from a pure empirical standpoint. In other words, one is what percent of kids vaccination that change, like actually, let me articulate it this way. the mandate in public schools, how much juice are we getting from that particular policy? Particularly in a world where more and more kids are getting homeschooled, where there may be vouchers to other programs, where that. So first I want to really quantify how much juice we're getting from that policy before I come in and say, absolutely don't touch it or touch it. We should be very clear, what is the downside of him playing with that? The next thing I'd say is if he were to play with it, the first thing to play with is to say, you only are mandated for the things that are universally recognized across 12 nations or 15 nations, rather than the US schedule or bust. Give people some flexibility, let them, change it a little bit, let them go to, what Sweden does, for instance. I think that's the next thing I would suggest to him.
So that would preserve things like MMR and polio.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Things I don't want to see again. Yeah, things we don't want to see.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'd say is you talked about the hectoring. I actually think in some ways people say, I think there are a lot of well-intentioned doctors and public health figures who are making this problem worse. Why are they making it worse? Like, again, when they say things like all vaccines are safe and effective, when they don't have any knowledge of the issues. And honestly, when you're a pediatrician, you're not really trained to assess vaccine safety. Drug safety is a very unique type of statistical analysis. I'm pretty sure most doctors have never done those kinds of large epidemiologic studies or know their pitfalls or limitations. And that makes it very difficult for people to say, we just need more doctors to speak out. I think if you're not very well versed in the topic, you should not speak out. You should be quiet and let people who are speak out, because you'll dig your hole even deeper. You'll give fuel for people who disagree with you by making specious arguments.
I think in general, we need fewer people speaking out these days, right? It's a little bit of the same as like the movement a few years back of like, oh, well, bring your whole self to work. And it's like, please do not do that. In fact, we've had a whole generation of people doing that. Like, bring less to work.
Yes, we're in favor of the quiet down movement. So I want to ask you, one more vaccine policy question I want to ask you about, because this is a big one. RFK has talked about undoing the vaccine liability shields, which they gained in the 1980s. I started going down a rabbit hole on this a little bit because I think understanding the history of how we got there is really important to understand whether we should continue with it or not. And I've been listening a lot to Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok's podcast, which is all about what they call the great forgetting, where we kind of forget the lessons of history and maybe are just like repeating them over and over again. I want to make sure we're not doing that here. What happened here is that there was a shortage of the whooping cough vaccine in the 1980s. 2 out of 3 this is from a New York Times article from the time. It says 2 of the 3 American manufacturers of the product decided to halt or restrict its sales. Both cited costs associated with lawsuits brought by parents whose children had been harmed by the vaccine. And if one of the manufacturers said that if current use patterns continue beginning in January 1985, supplies of DDT vaccines will be very limited and some areas may be without DDT vaccines. Now, a little bit further context I just want to put on this before I put the question to you is that just because people were suing and winning against these manufacturers did not necessarily mean that the vaccines were causing all of these problems. This goes back to the lawyer versus physician distinction that you talked about in the beginning, where it's perhaps easier to convince a jury of something that is not exactly true. There was a writer who wrote a whole book about this when this was all happening called Galileo's Revenge, named Peter Huber. And he wrote that about this whooping cough issue, there was a 1984 English study, serious and cautiously phrased in itself, that suggested that the vaccine's use might be causing 25 cases a year of serious brain damage. And American lawyers responded with an avalanche of litigation, blaming the vaccine for brain damage, unexplained coma, epilepsy. More solid scientific evidence slowly accumulated. Then in March 1990, a report of a huge study of 230,000 children and 713,000 immunizations concluded the vaccine had caused no serious neurological complications of any kind and no deaths. But the sort of economic damage had already been done. The response was, well, we need vaccines so whooping cough doesn't come back. So we're going to shield the manufacturers, and then the government will pay out these claims through the VAERS system. RFK wants to rethink that. What say you?
Well, I'm actually a little bit sympathetic to this idea, and let me give you my reasoning. I mean, I think the 1986 law that shielded them from litigation occurred in a world where making vaccines was not a very lucrative business. I mean, you didn't make a lot of money making vaccines, and if you didn't have that kind of shielding, you could very easily go bankrupt. Now, fast forward, Pfizer made $100 billion off COVID-19 vaccines. The new maternal RSV vaccine is over $300 a dose. So now vaccine business is really good. And so that's one difference. The next difference is people say like,
I just want to ask a question. The maternal RSV vaccine, seemingly this confers protection to like a newborn baby, right?
correct. Yes.
Well, so doesn't it make sense that they should like profit like madmen, because that's like a huge issue? Like, I don't know. I mean, I had my kid 2 years ago, but like this is a huge thing in mom circles where it's like RSV for extremely young children is horrible. And so the fact that now we have the technology to sort of begin to prevent against that, like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe
That was
they
the
should
only
make
time
them,
my
right?
child ever went to the hospital, went to the ER, by the way, when he got RSV. Much more serious than COVID for children.
I mean, that
which
just
was
strikes me like
That's
that strikes
true.
me like a good deal
Well,
at
no.
twice the price. What do you make of that?
I guess one is I'm not opposed to manufacturers that make good products making a windfall of money, but the question is the litigation. So
Yeah.
drugs make windfalls of money if they're really good, but you're allowed to litigate a drug maker. Vaccines
Yeah.
make windfalls of money. You're not allowed to litigate them. So that's one distinction. But two,
Okay.
the RSV, maternal RSV vaccine, very interestingly, the endpoint of the study being hospitalized with a lower respiratory tract RSV infection is decreased, but the overall endpoint of being hospitalized with any respiratory virus is not decreased in that study. So it is a bit of an interesting product. Meanwhile, there are other products like a monoclonal antibody given after birth that do have the better endpoint, but put that aside.
Okay. That's really interesting.
Yeah, put that aside. I guess the point is that we do allow people who make great products to make a lot of money. This is one space where not only we allow them to make a lot of money, we shield them from litigation. Whereas a drug maker makes a lot of money and they're not shielded. They could get litigated for Vioxx or for a product that has some untoward safety signal. In my mind, if I were to advise him, I'd say rather than try to have a single policy removing the litigation shield for every product, including some of these cheaper, older products, start by saying any new product or any product that costs over $200 or any product that makes over, $500 million in revenue, they will be the first to lose the shield on that product. And then over time, we'll see what happens with that policy. I would pursue a gradated policy change. But I guess in my mind, in America, if you're making $100 billion, whether it's an injection or a pill, you should be open to litigation. I mean, you got the money to cover the litigation.
Yeah. My biggest worry about it is that the drug companies are operating in such a regulated environment that without also sort of loosening up and allowing things to get to market, like it's so expensive to get everything to market. And that it's like, this is the same problem that the nuclear industry encountered, right? Is like, they're so they're under such a heavy burden of regulation that then the only way to make it economically viable is to offer this liability shield for things. And then that causes its own perverse outcomes. So I agree with you that it's definitely not an ideal system and people should be held liable for their harms. I guess it raises like the larger concern that I want to like bring this conversation to a close with, which is like, one of my biggest worries is that with RFK leaning on the FDA from his perch and often, looking into the EU as his guide, is that we're going to see a slowdown in drug and medical innovation. I mean, this is what the picture looks like in terms of drugs coming out of the EU. That second bar is the EU. The first one is the United States. You see an upward trajectory for us and like total flat line for EU. Another way to look at it is just, this is all from a Politico report on this topic, is you see biopharma startups in the US upwards, China now dwarfing the EU kind of stagnant. Given that innovation is flatline there, like how do you rate the danger of RFK grinding us to a halt or maybe even sending us backwards along that dimension?
It's such a great question. And there's sort of a broader philosophical thing you're talking about, which is, if you want more products, including more great products, the more money you let people make for those products and the easier it is to come on the market, the more of those things you're going to get. But then probably at some point, you might be flooded. You might make it so lucrative that you make millions of billions of dollars from even products that don't work, and you've over incentivized the space.
True.
So there's some curve here. Economists have, they have theories what the curve looks like, but empirically we have no idea what the curve looks like. So I guess I don't know if we're on the sweet spot of the curve, if we're actually over incentivized products. Maybe that's why we have so many marginal cancer drugs. If we've under incentivized great products, maybe the problem with our system is we don't have a way to have more incentives for the great stuff and less incentives for the mediocre drugs. So it's a really sort of huge set of issues. I think the reality of what RFK faces is that his own party, there's two minds. RFK's mind, we've discussed. I think he's somebody who'll be incredibly critical of easy approvals. But you've got Ramaswamy. Ramaswamy is the exact opposite end of the spectrum. And so many people like him. Ramaswamy, of course, was a drug developer. And I think he would favor the FDA having much fewer restrictions and letting much more competitors on the market. We had, there's a guy, Ed O'Neill, who's floated as a name for FDA commissioner a few years ago. He thinks the FDA should only provide the safety label, phase 1 safety study labeled, no efficacy claim. So, there's a range of ideas in this space. I guess I suspect that of all the domains he goes after, I think this is the hardest space that you're to actually do any substantive change, particularly a change that makes it harder for the companies to bring products to market, for the simple reason that nobody has put more money into Congress, the presidency, than the biopharmaceutical industry. I mean, maybe oil and natural gas. They have lobbied this for so long, so hard. Some of these rules are so Byzantine, it's going to be hard to go into FDA and raise the bar dramatically and bring the markets to a halt. That's my general thought. But honestly, as an empirical question, I don't know where we are. In my field of oncology, I'm biased because I think there are a few great drugs. There's just a flood of useless drugs, and we have over-incentivized this space. But in other fields like infectious disease, neurologic disease, we may have under-incentivized it. We're not getting great drugs for a lot of these rare childhood diseases and neurologic disorders. So perhaps it needs to be field by field dependent.
I like that Zach is like, won't anybody think of the pharmaceutical industry, right? But also, legitimately, that type of viewpoint, I think this is kind of what libertarians offer because it's increasingly scarce these days. And the trade-offs are real of the more you crack down on a given industry, the more you demonize or vilify them, or specifically have laws and regulations that reflect that vilification, the less likely it is that they will make profit from innovations, the less likely it is that more people will innovate, and that's a very real cost, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the customers who are not going to have that life-saving drug more so than the CEO sitting in the boardroom. But I do appreciate the characterization, Liz.
I know you're
wearing monocled libertarian.
I know you're not Martin Shkreli. You're close to Martin Shkreli, but you're not quite there yet, Zach. You still have some work to do. But this one thing that I've been mulling over the course of this entire conversation that I really want to get both of your opinions on is RFK Jr.'s platform sort of best summarized as just make America more like Europe?
Oh, are you asking me? Because
everybody,
I see where you're coming from with it, but I'm more interested to hear from.
I guess I think in some ways, previously he's expressed admiration for Medicare for all. In some ways, it's sort of a more traditional Democrat, which of course he is a Democrat, historically view, which is to make America more like Sweden and Finland. But in some ways, I think it is that environmental lawyer background, perhaps overly skeptical, going beyond what they do in Europe and being a little bit too critical of those things. So to me, it's not exactly a European mentality. Of anybody I know, I think in many ways, he's sort of extreme anti-corporatist, which is something Trump did very different. Trump reimagined the Republican Party. Before Trump, the Republican Party was lockstep with pharma. Now, in the last election cycle, they donated more to Kamala Harris than to Donald Trump. So he's really kind of changed what republicanism means for the industry. RFK Jr., I would put him as sort of an extreme center-left European sort of socialist Democrat kind of view with a little bit of extra, perhaps paranoia sprinkled on top from the environmental law standpoint.
He's like a really paranoid European.
I wanted to ask you about a couple of the other appointments, just because the whole health the bureau of the federal government is being shaken up, and two of the names that have been out there are Marty Makary at FDA. It looks like that's happening. And then Jay Bhattacharya potentially at NIH. What do you think of those type. I mean, this is really like between those three, it's like, okay, we are getting the message. This is the COVID accountability backlash right here. What do you think of those appointments?
And Doc, don't forget Dr. Oz. So I guess Dr. Oz and Marty have been named by Trump, and I have yet to see, unless it became press release while we were talking, I've yet to see Jay be formally named as NIH director's name.
No, yeah.
So Marty, I would say Marty is sort of, a pretty, I think I love how the media describes him, like Marty Macri once shook hands with Donald Trump. He's an anti-lockdown guy. I'm like, well, Marty Macri is a professor of surgery who's been at Hopkins for 20 plus years. He's got like 300 publications, 3 best-selling books. The themes of his books are providing better healthcare at lower price. He's really sort of a tried and true academic. Yes, on COVID, he had views that went against Anthony Fauci. Surprise, he was right on pretty much all of those views.
You don't have to sell me anymore on him.
But I mean, I think he's going to be, I think one thing is when they named RFK Jr., the industry markets went down. And when they named Marty, I think the pharmaceutical industry sort of stayed stable. I think he'll be a stabilizing force, maybe some small changes around the edge. I think Marty will sail through confirmation. Jay, I think, would be great at NIH. I think Jay is an extremely thoughtful person. I think he's skeptical of a lot of things. People are skeptical, which is why are so much NIH dollars going for diversity, sort of grant supplements and things that are increasingly in vogue culturally. I think Jay might do some stuff to strengthen NIH and reproducibility and eliminate some of the problems that happened under Collins and Fauci. Oz, I think, Oz is going to have a difficult time in the hearings for all his sort of marketing over the years and marketing sort of alternative medicine products. I think one thing people don't know about Oz is that, even before Oz ever set foot on Oprah Winfrey's show back in the early 2000s, or maybe I think early 2000s, Dr. Oz ran a clinic of complementary medicine for people getting cardiac surgery at Columbia. He's been in the alternative and complementary medicine wellness business even before Oprah. I mean, that's why he was discovered. And then he took it to the next level in the Dr. Oz show. And I think a lot of that stuff is, as an evidence-based person, I don't support, I don't endorse, I'm skeptical of those alternative medicine things. But I think it's a mistake to think it's a new thing in his life. It's been there for his whole career. But what I know about him is I've heard he's actually a very good surgeon, and he's a very smart guy, and he's a smooth operator. And so he might be able to sail through. Will he do anything substantively in Medicare? His prior position is he's pro-Medicare Advantage, which is a private policy that a number of recent studies show cost more, doesn't provide better care. I'm not sure what he's going to do in Medicare unless he can rein in Medicare Advantage. So I don't know what he's going to do specifically. Those are my thoughts of those people.
Has anyone propositioned you?
I've not been propositioned.
Is that what they call it?
Here right now.
Propositioned.
I'm just trial ballooning. I'm manifesting this into existence.
I'm a humble professor and a doctor here at UCSF. So
I mean, the common thread I see through all of those choices, and including you in this mix, is a desire to sort of question, like, how can the medical profession actually course correct instead of getting stuck in these dogmatic, immovable paradigms. Like that was one thing that I read a little bit of Marty Makari's book, and that was really my takeaway from it. He tells like the story of during the AIDS epidemic when there was the issue of AIDS or HIV being transmitted via blood transfusions, and the public health establishment, including Anthony Fauci, him perhaps most of all, wanted to just bury their head in the sand. Trust the science. Your chance of getting this from a blood transfusion is like less than, getting landed on by a whale when you're kayaking or something. Like, it's like this is, and then of course it came out that this was a real risk, and people were sounding the alarm, but it took years, and people needlessly were infected during that interim period. Do you have any optimism that someone like Makari or any of these folks can actually get to whatever fundamental problem is going on there that's corrected, that's preventing a more nimble course correction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and of course, now universal screening is a given. I just want to add one more thing. You say that everyone was on the other side of the COVID issues, but look at the Surgeon General nominee. I think that's somebody who was not, actually in many ways was promoting the establishment position. So I'm not sure if that applies to everybody. But in the case of Marty, I think what Marty has that, and Jay has, I would say Marty and Jay particularly, is that they do not subscribe to groupthink. I mean, it was very difficult to actually say the American Academy of Pediatrics is wrong about masking your 2-year-old, and I will say so and stake my whole reputation, get a deluge of hate. That's a very rare position. Most academics go with the herd. They follow groupthink. These people don't. Now, that means I think that they are less likely to make a certain type of error, and that they may be able to actually go into FDA and shake things up. And so I think I'm excited to see what they do. And I guess the last point is, I guess I'd say I've been in this business for 20 years and I follow very closely regulatory policy. It's like a big focus of my research lab. And in 20 years, I have not seen too many exciting ideas. We argue so much about such incremental things while the whole Titanic is sinking. And I think it's refreshing to actually argue about these big substantive things. And if I said before, if 3 out of 5 of their ideas is right, that might be enough for a lot of people to feel a difference and to support them, even if 2 out of 5 are actually wrong. And I think to some degree, that's what people voted for.
Let me bring in one audience question, and then we'll ask you the final question of the show, because it's related. And I happened to see this earlier from Christopher DeSaro. He said, to build off Liz's earlier question, do you think that leaving the merits of RFK's views to be fleshed out in the marketplace of ideas is perhaps too generous or expecting too much of people? You're expressing excitement, Vinay, about this marketplace of ideas sort of being reinvigorated. Do you have any nervousness or apprehension that people just aren't going to be able to handle it and we're just going to be awash in a world of quackery and pseudoscience that harms a lot of people?
You mean like how they couldn't handle different ideas during COVID? Yeah. So I think there's a track record. People can't handle different ideas. But to Chris's point, I mean, I guess I'd say that, like, let's just take 2 examples. The FDA approved a drug called voxelotor for sickle cell disease. This was approved because it increased hemoglobin 1 point. They approved it for kids as young as 12 years old. There was no evidence that sickle cell kids had less pain crises, that they lived longer, that they felt better. None of that evidence was generated. The drug was marketed for many years. It was withdrawn from market by Pfizer this year because it increases sickle cell crises and death. We don't know how much of each. I think many people don't know the current status quo for FDA drug regulation is so bad that we approve all sorts of drugs for kids, for people with diseases that don't make them live longer, don't make them live better, cost us all a fortune. If RFK goes in and he approves ivermectin here or there, I don't think it's going to change that much. It's not that different than the status quo. No one's going to prescribe ivermectin. There's not going to be an attractive ivermectin sales rep coming to every doctor's office detailing them. In many ways, the real threat is the really expensive marginal drug products that don't work because they have a tremendous marketing force. Ivermectin will always be left to the fringes with hydroxychloroquine and zinc and whatever. And if you want to see people self-medicate with things that don't work, go to the supplement aisle of your Costco and you'll see, we allow a mountain of this kind of self-medication. Do I think a few people will have adverse drug reactions? Yes, that will be bad. But I do worry that, it's, again, policy it can never solve all the problems. It can just try to, do the best we can. I'm not tremendously worried about him approving those kinds of marginal drugs and what it'll do. There are other things he said that I'm more worried about.
This is just a comment I want to bring up before we wrap. This is from J. Dub Jr. Vinay has helped me stay sane the last 4 years, especially at the height of COVID idiocy. Tell him thank you for being such an intelligent voice. I'll echo that too. Thank you, Vinay. Let me ask you the final question of the show, which we ask all our guests, which is, what is a question that you think more people should be asking?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think more people should be asking what did the last person who held this job do? I think when you talk about Marty for FDA commissioner, you should ask, well, what was the things that Califf did that were very notable? Here's what I think Califf did that was notable, just off the top of my head. Bob Califf, he said, misinformation is the #1 cause of death, a statistic he pulled directly from his ass, and it's missing. So he literally had a misinformation statistic on misinformation. Bob Califf said that everyone should get boosters over the age of 6 months, over and over again. Bob Califf said you should take Paxlovid even if you've already been vaccinated. Bob Califf approved Exondys, which is a drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, against the advice of the primary reviewers. He approved, he was at the helm when aducanumab was approved, an Alzheimer's drug that doesn't work. So I think and look at Javier Becerra at HHS. Whatever the position is you're evaluating, media should take a look at the predecessor. What were their accomplishments and what were their failures? And then let's talk about RFK. Let's talk about Marty. Let's talk about Jay. I think that puts it in perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for walking us through all that. It's a complicated morass, and you are such an excellent guide through it. So thank you for joining us, Vinay.
Thanks for having me. Great discussion.
All right. We'll see you all next week.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. We drop a new episode every Thursday, so if you want to support the work we do, please like and share this episode, subscribe to our new YouTube channel, and follow the show on your favorite podcasting app. See you next time.